of their tradition, whether they're Jewish, Christian, or Muslim, they're going to have a lot of shared terms and similarities. And so he was able to see very clearly what the creed of Imam Tahawi was. It's a summation of Muslim belief in 130 statements, and what he articulated is that Christians, it would be very useful for Christians to read this, because in a very short time they can get a beautiful and concise summation of what Muslims believe exactly. And so I thought that was very useful, how he articulated that. So, for instance, you have the Nicene Creed in Christianity, the Athanasian Creed. You have these different early creeds of the Christians, the Didache, and they articulated early Christian belief. There was a lot of debates in Christianity. And in the Islamic tradition, you had early on, you had quite a few splits. You had the Mu'tazilite, you had the Khawarij, you had the Mutakallimun, who were more dialecticians working in a Hellenistic tradition and using a lot of Hellenistic terms. And then you had people like Imam Tahawi that were really trying to articulate a creed that was rooted directly in the Quran and when necessary in the Sunnah. But because the Sunnah is divided into solitary transmissions, what are called ahad hadith, and then mutawatir, which are multiply transmitted hadiths. The creed generally was taken only from mutawatir, which are quite few, they're not that many. So it was very important for them not to really distinguish what was essential and what was incidental. And that's what Imam Tahawi tries to do. He really lays out what is essential. One of the major problems in Muslim discourse today is that Muslims get involved in a lot of these, what are called far'iyat, the branches, and they forget about the roots. And so they get caught up and they argue about these things that really there's no need to argue about them, because one, most of them are insoluble. We just don't have answers for them. And that's why the best position is Allahu A'lam. But the essentials, the Muslim religion, is an incredibly unified religion. I mean, it's one of the stunning aspects of our religion. If you really look at these early articulations, what you find is that they agreed on their religion to an extraordinary degree. And for that reason, Muslims were reasonably well united. I mean, one of the beauties of our tradition, if you go from Indonesia to Morocco in the pre-modern classical formulations, what you're going to find is there were basically three creedal formulations that were being taught. The Maturidi, from Abu Mansur al-Maturidi, he's a 4th century, late 3rd, early 4th century scholar. Abu Hassan al-Ash'ari. And then you have what could be considered an Athari tradition. I mean, people today would probably call it a Salafi tradition. And these three, although they differed, I mean, they're actually very close. I mean, there are differences, but they're so close that those differences are rather negligible. And for that reason, they tend to respect each other. I mean, you have periods where they locked horns, particularly with certain, amongst the Hanabila, there were a certain group of Hanabila that tended to lock horns with the Ash'aris.
Baghdad tended to be
in Baghdad there were a lot of problems. Yeah, and you find that amongst in the early period, but you find that in fiqh also. Imam Tabari was attacked by the Hanbalis. His house was literally seized, and they threw rocks at him. You have those problems, but the Hanbalis tended to incline towards a very rigid doctrine in which they did not allow for any speculative discourse about God. And they did that because they wanted to preserve some. They didn't want people to venture in to areas that were the unknown. Yeah. But the other scholars felt, look, we're being confronted with materialists, with the Qadariyya, determinist, with rationalists, all these different groups. They're throwing this stuff at us, and if we don't respond, if we don't use our knowledge to respond to these obfuscations, shubuhat, these doubtful matters, then we're jeopardizing our faith. We're jeopardizing people's faith. Now, one of the problems today, we have young Muslims that go to university, they study evolution, they study dialectical materialism, they study postmodernism, they study, and then you have people say, "A'udhu billah, it's a bid'ah to teach them, aqeedah or something like that." They're being confronted with really difficult concepts, and then they've got teachers that are very clever. I mean, in Europe, atheism is quite widespread. There are a lot of people. You have people like Richard Dawkins, who write very sophisticated books, and they come with very strong arguments, and people read these and get confused. Somebody came up to me last night, I gave a talk, and somebody came up to me last night, and she just said, how do you logically prove the existence of God? Is it something you can prove? Well, for Muslims, the Quran says, "Afillahi shak." Is there any doubt about God? I mean, that's a rhetorical question from God. Is there any doubt about God? The Quran begins, Alif Lam Mim, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. This is the book, there's no doubt in it. Now, people can say, well, so you have a self-attesting book. I believe in God. Why? Because the Quran says for me to believe in God. Well, how do you know the Quran's true? Because God says it's true. Well, how do you know? Where does He say that? In the Quran. So you get into this circular reasoning, and people outside of the faith, they deem it ridiculous or absurd. Because of that, in the Islamic tradition, you had a natural theology develop. There was an attempt to root theology in something outside of revelation so that people could have a firm grasp of belief in a way that was not self-attesting, that it didn't have, the proof wasn't within the very thing that you were trying to prove. Mm-hmm. So that was one attempt. There were two other very interesting attempts. One was to prove the miraculous nature of the Quran, which is called i'jaz al-Quran. And that was done in several ways. One of them was the linguistic nature of the Quran. Al-Baqallani focused on that. Of late, you've had certain scientific aspects, i'jaz al-ilmi, i'jaz al-adadi, the numerical miracles of the Quran. The other was what was called Dalail al-Nubuwwah, and that's the one I find more interesting. Dalail al-Nubuwwah is to prove the inerrant nature of the Prophet, that the Prophet himself came with certain proofs. Once you establish those proofs, to deny the Prophet was basically just kufr. It was a type of rejection of a truth that was so evident. And some of those were done through his predictions. I mean, for instance, I was telling my brother the other day, there's a hadith that the end of time won't come until a man's shoe talks to him. Now, when I first read that hadith, it just sounded so far-fetched to me. It really sounded strange as a hadith. I mean, I admit that. When I read it, I was thinking, why would anybody have a shoe that talked? Although, I'm living in an age of miracles and wonders.
Interesting times.
Yeah, no, it is. It's the boy in the bubble and the baby with the baboon heart, right? It's very odd time. So you have, if you look at this hadith about the talking shoe, so I read that years ago, and well, lo and behold, a couple months ago, I'm reading the New York Times, and there's an article, "These shoes are made for talking." And the article was about Nike produced a shoe now that tells you in a digital voice, you can ask it, how far have you walked? And it'll tell you in a digital voice, you have walked 2.5 miles. So when I told my brother that, he said, that's prophecy, right? He's a lawyer. I mean, lawyers, they deal in evidence, right? He just said to me, that's prophecy, to see that. The Prophet ﷺ predicted a fire near Medina that he said would be so great that it would illumine the necks of camels in Busra, which is on the border of Syria and Saudi Arabia today. Now, that sounded crazy at the time for somebody to think of that, the Arabs, to think of a fire so great that it would illumine a place in Syria. Well, lo and behold, 1258, there was six major volcanic eruptions just outside of Medina. A fire extended 200 kilometers. I've seen it. I've been there. And 70 kilometers wide. Now, I was there with a Welsh geologist who is not a Muslim, scientist, and we filmed him outside of the haram, and we have him on tape, and this lava flow went towards the city, and right before it got to Medina, it literally begins to go uphill.
So against the
force of gravity, it goes up towards Mount Uhud. And I asked him, why did it turn like that? Because you can see it on the satellite thing. He said, I have no scientific explanation for that. This is a PhD in geology. I have no scientific explanation. He said, I heard people prayed, and I guess their prayers got answered. And then I asked him, how far would have this light been seen? He said, this was massive. It would have been seen probably to the borders of Iraq. I mean, that's what